The courtroom was colder than Helen expected. Not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The stale hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the occasional shuffle of paper or the creak of an old wooden bench. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and anxiety. She sat 2 rows from the front, wearing a navy blue suit she hadn't touched since her retirement party, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the empty chair at the plaintiff's table. Her uncle's name, Edwin Clark, was carved into the bronze nameplate still affixed to the large oak desk at his old law firm's office. She'd run her fingers over it just last week, after the funeral, when the executor of his will told her, gently, apologetically, that she wasn't listed among the beneficiaries. Not even a mention. Not a book, not a photo, not a dollar. Helen didn't cry. Not then. Not even now. But she did feel something shift inside her. Something old, buried beneath years of polite restraint. A quiet defiance that clicked into place like the final bead in a long-abandoned abacus. She scanned the courtroom. Across the aisle, a row of distant relatives, some of whom she barely recognized, chatted in low, eager tones. A woman in pearls. And a tight smile, Janet, was Edwin's second cousin on his mother's side. She was already talking about liquidating the Montana cabin. Helen overheard. She always overheard. The judge entered with little ceremony. Everyone rose. His robe looked stiff, as if he hadn't moved much that morning. He sat, glanced at the docket, and announced, "This is the matter of Clark versus estate." Papers shuffled. Attorneys on both sides murmured greetings. Helen remained seated, the only unaccompanied figure on either side of the gallery. The first hour passed in procedural exchange. Helen waited. Patient, invisible. Her moment would come then. The judge cleared his throat. "Before we proceed to final declarations, we understand that Ms. Helen Browning has requested to speak. Ms. Browning, are you present?" She rose slowly. "Yes, Your Honor." "Please approach." Helen walked with measured steps, heart steady, breath controlled. She stopped before the bench, chin slightly raised. The judge peered down at her. "You understand, Ms. Browning, that you are not a named party in this matter?" "I understand, sir," she said evenly. "And you're not listed in the will?" "Not in the will that was filed, no." He frowned. Then, respectfully, "This isn't about you." The words echoed, so curt, so dismissive. She could feel the heat of 20 pairs of eyes behind her. But Helen didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said calmly, reaching into her leather tote, "it is about a codicil. Signed and notarized. Dated February 14th, 4 years after the last revision of Mr. Clark's will. It was kept in his private lockbox. I have both the document and the affidavit from the notary public, along with a statement from the locksmith who opened the box in the presence of my attorney and a court officer." She placed the envelope on the evidence table. Silence. Thick and immediate. The judge's eyes narrowed. He gestured for the clerk to retrieve the documents. The rustling of the envelope sounded deafening in the quiet room. Janet rose halfway from her seat, as if trying to get a better look, before her lawyer gently pulled her back down. Helen didn't return to her seat. She stood there, a quiet pillar of resolve, as the judge reviewed the papers. A full minute passed. Then finally, he spoke, his voice slower now. "We'll take a short recess. This document appears authentic, but we need verification. Bailiff, please escort Ms. Browning to the witness room. Counsel, join me in chambers." As the judge left the bench, whispers erupted. Helen didn't look back. She walked calmly, escorted by a tall, expressionless officer. In the quiet of the witness room, she finally sat. She removed her blazer, folded it neatly beside her, and waited. She remembered the night she and Uncle Edwin had talked about legacy. It was just after her retirement. He'd asked about her regrets, and she'd said, "I regret not being bolder." He'd smiled, pouring her another glass of wine, and said, "Bolder doesn't always mean louder, Helen. Sometimes, it just means prepared." She had been, and now, the empty chair at the plaintiff's table might soon be hers. The walls of the witness room were barren, the kind of beige that made time feel slower. A single clock ticked overhead, loud and unbothered. Helen sat still, hands clasped in her lap, legs crossed at the ankle. There was no window, just a rectangular mirror on the far wall that she knew was one-way glass. Someone was likely watching her. Maybe the judge. Maybe a clerk. Maybe no one. She wasn't nervous. Instead, her mind drifted back to Edwin's voice, low, gravelly, and always certain. "There's a difference between fairness and formality," he had told her once, during one of their long Sunday dinners. "The court only knows the papers you give it. Truth doesn't file itself." Helen had never forgotten those words. She'd committed them to memory the same way she'd memorized tax codes and retirement regulations during her decades as an accountant, methodically, thoroughly. The door creaked open, and her attorney, Lewis Harmon, stepped inside, his tie slightly askew and brow furrowed. He'd been hired on short notice, a recommendation from an old colleague. Younger than her by 20 years, but sharp. Honest, they're verifying the codicil now, he said, sitting across from her. The judge requested a handwriting expert on standby. Helen nodded. I expected that. They're also questioning why you waited to produce it until today. She looked directly at him. Because if I had brought it earlier, they would have shredded it before it ever reached a courtroom. Janet has influence. You've seen how fast she moves. Louis tilted his head, studying her. You understand, if this codicil is authentic, and right now it seems it is, you won't just get a share. You'll inherit everything. Yes, she replied. I know. He leaned forward. That includes assets some of them have already assumed were theirs. They'll come at you hard, Helen. This isn't just about the money for them. It's about control. About legacy. She smiled faintly. I was invisible to them until 10 minutes ago. I know what they'll do. Louis looked at her for a long moment, then opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. The judge wants to reconvene in 30 minutes. You'll likely be asked to speak formally. Sworn testimony. Stick to what you know. Don't speculate. I don't need to speculate, she said. I have facts. A faint knock on the door interrupted them. A clerk peeked in. Miss Browning, Judge Fallon will see you now. Alone. Helen stood, smoothing her blouse. Of course. The judges' chambers were a world apart from the courtroom, warm, wood-paneled, with leather-bound books lining shelves that reached the ceiling. A dark green banker's lamp glowed softly on the desk where Judge Fallon sat, reading the codicil with intense concentration. He didn't look up as she entered. Please sit, Ms. Browning. She obeyed, settling into a chair opposite him. He held the document up. This is, frankly, extraordinary. It names you sole heir and executor. It revokes all prior versions of the will. It's signed, notarized, and, based on preliminary verification, appears entirely legitimate. Helen remained quiet, hands folded. Fallon set the paper down. Why didn't your uncle file it with the rest of his legal documents? He told me he didn't trust the firm anymore, she answered plainly. Too many hands in the drawer. Too many people with access. Fallon tapped a pen against the armrest. And why didn't he inform any other family members of the update? He didn't want to be pressured. Edwin was private. He said if they knew, they'd manipulate him, or worse, contest it out of spite. Why you? She looked him in the eye. Because I never asked him for anything. The judge didn't reply for a moment. Then, with a nod, he said, we'll resume in court shortly. I will inform the parties of the codicil's probable validity. You'll be called to testify. Be prepared for hostility. I always am, she said softly. Back in the courtroom, the air had changed. People leaned forward. Janet's eyes were sharp and burning now, her attorney whispering furiously in her ear. Other relatives exchanged glances, some confused, others suddenly alert, as if waking from a long nap to find the world had shifted. Judge Fallon took the bench, his voice firm. We've reviewed a codicil to the will of Edwin Clark, submitted by Ms. Helen Browning. This codicil is dated, signed, and notarized. It is materially different from the will currently in probate. We will now hear sworn testimony from Ms. Browning. Helen stepped forward, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore the oath. Her voice didn't tremble. She told the story, the dinner conversation that sparked Edwin's decision to revise the will. The night he showed her the document. Before sealing it in his personal lockbox. The locksmith, the affidavit, the chain of custody. She never exaggerated. Never drifted from facts. Just truth, steady and plain. The judge listened carefully. Opposing counsel attempted to interrupt, raised objections, questioned timing, suggested manipulation. But Helen held fast. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't need to be. When she finished, the room was silent again. Fallon folded his hands. Unless counsel can provide evidence disputing the codicil's validity, this court will proceed with the assumption that it supersedes all prior wills. A ripple of sound, a gasp here, a whisper there. Janet stood suddenly. This is a setup, she hissed. She was nobody. The judge slammed his gavel. Enough, Miss Sinclair. Sit down or leave the courtroom. Helen didn't look at Janet. She looked at the judge. He nodded. It wasn't over, not yet. There would be more filings, perhaps an appeal. But the scales had tipped. She was no longer the woman the judge said it wasn't about. Now, she was the center of everything. Helen stood at the top of the courthouse steps, sunlight hitting her face for the first time in hours. The proceedings had adjourned for the day. No final ruling yet. Judge Fallon wanted further handwriting verification and a formal review of the notary's affidavit before issuing a definitive judgment. But the direction was clear. The courtroom's energy had changed. She'd felt it like a shift in wind before a storm. She turned slightly and saw Louis walking toward her, files tucked beneath one arm. "You made a lot of people nervous in there," he said, shielding his eyes from the glare. "They should be," Helen replied. Her voice wasn't smug, just calm. Grounded. He hesitated, then added, "Judge Fallon will likely call for a continuance to allow time for formal submission of all materials. But barring any real surprises, this codicil will hold. They'll contest it, probably hard, but you've got a strong position." Helen nodded and looked down at the street below. Cars moved slowly, unaware of the war unfolding several stories above them. She'd lived most of her life in the quiet lane, followed the rules, paid her taxes, avoided conflict. But not anymore. "Did you find what I asked for?" she said. Louis reached into his file and handed her a single sheet of paper. "Property records. The Montana cabin. Your uncle's name is still on the deed." Helen studied the document, fingers brushing the faded black ink. "He loved that place," she murmured. "Ever been?" Louis asked. She shook her head. "He invited me once. I declined. It felt indulgent back then." He glanced at his watch. "They're going to start moving assets around behind the scenes, bank accounts, stocks, the New Haven house. You'll need to freeze them once you're named executor." "I know." Louis tilted his head. "You okay, Helen?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment, her guard softened. "I've always been overlooked, Mr. Harmon. The quiet niece. The woman who did her job and never asked for more. But Edwin saw me. Not just in that codicil. In life." She paused. "I don't need revenge. I just need what's mine. What was meant for me." He gave a small, respectful nod. "Then let's get it done." The next morning, Helen was already up when the courier arrived. A man in a navy vest handed her a large envelope and asked her to sign. She closed the door before opening it. Inside was a certified copy of Edwin's codicil, newly validated by the county registrar. Attached was a second envelope, unmarked except for her name, written in her uncle's tight, elegant script. She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter. "Helen, if you're reading this, then I've already irritated a lot of people." "Good. You were always the one who saw past noise. You don't chase things, Helen. You watch. You wait. You think. That's why I chose you. Not because of blood or obligation, but because you are steady. Quiet strength is still strength. The cabin is yours now. Go there. You'll find everything you need to understand what I left behind. Be kind, but never small." Edwin. She read it twice. Then a third time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear or anger, but from the weight of something deeper. Recognition. Grief. Maybe even gratitude. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. 2 days later, Helen stood outside a modest log cabin nestled in the pines of northern Montana. She'd taken a direct flight and rented a car from the tiny airport, driving nearly 3 hours along winding roads flanked by trees so tall they darkened the sky. The cabin looked just as Edwin had described in stories. Rustic but dignified. A porch swing hung off the left side. The wood creaked beneath her boots as she stepped toward the door. She unlocked it with a brass key Louis had recovered from Edwin's safety deposit box. It turned smoothly. Inside, everything was untouched. Blankets folded neatly on the sofa. A coffee mug in the sink. Books stacked in small towers beside the fireplace. Dust hung gently in the air, disturbed only by the creak of her footsteps. In the back room, what had once been his office, she found a metal file cabinet, locked. She used the second key from the envelope. Inside, folders, letters, photographs, and an old ledger labeled in black pen, Browning, personal notes. She pulled it out slowly, her heart thudding in her chest, page after page of handwritten observations. Memories. Kind words. Descriptions of her life, some she didn't even realize he'd noticed. "Helen never asks for anything. She brings soup when I'm sick. She never stays long, just enough. She knows how to leave people in peace, not pieces. She forgave her brother faster than I ever could. She sees everyone, but no one sees her. That's going to change." Tears welled in her eyes. She sat there for a long time, the cabin silent around her. Outside, the wind rustled the pine trees. Inside, Helen felt something shift again, not like in the courtroom, but deeper. A door opening where none had existed before. She wasn't just the legal heir. She was the emotional one. The chosen one. She closed the ledger, stood, and exhaled. This wasn't over, but it was hers. 3 weeks had passed since Helen's trip to the Montana cabin, and the world beyond the pines hadn't stayed quiet. By the time she returned to Connecticut, a formal petition had been filed to contest the codicil. The notice came in the form of a thick envelope delivered by a process server who seemed almost embarrassed to hand it to her. Inside, the signatures of Janet Sinclair, Marvin Delaney, and 2 others she remembered only vaguely from family reunions. people who hadn't spoken to Edwin in years but were now suddenly clinging to the idea that he'd been manipulated. That Helen had coerced an elderly man. That this sudden change was suspect. It was a war, and it had begun. Helen sat across from Louis in his office, a quiet room lined with legal books and muted confidence. He was calm as always, but she could see the pressure building behind his eyes. "They're claiming undue influence," he said. "It's textbook. When someone contests a late-stage will amendment, this is the angle they take. Especially if the revision benefits a single person over a group. And they'll drag it out," she said. Louis nodded. "That's the strategy. Delay. Intimidate. Try to drain your energy or resources until you settle." "I'm not settling," Helen said quietly. He gave her a look. "Good. Then we prepare for depositions." The first came from Janet. Helen wasn't present for the interview, but the transcript landed on Louis's desk within the week. Janet Sinclair. Helen was always hovering around Uncle Edwin in his last years. She brought him meals, drove him to appointments, classic positioning. "I believe he was emotionally manipulated." Attorney. "Did Mr. Clark ever express concern about Helen's behavior?" Janet Sinclair. "Not directly. But he was old. He didn't always realize when someone was taking advantage of him." Helen read it twice, her jaw tightening. She hadn't hovered. She had been present. "There's a difference." Marvin's statement was even more calculated. Marvin Delaney. "Edwin wasn't himself those last couple years. He started canceling family events, ignoring emails. We assumed it was health-related, but now, in light of this will change, it feels more sinister." They were painting a portrait of Edwin as weak, confused, isolated, but Helen had the ledger. The letters. The receipts. She had proof that Edwin had been clear-eyed to the end. She also had someone else. "Do you remember me?" The voice on the phone asked. Helen stood in her kitchen, the sunlight just beginning to creep through the window above the sink. She hadn't recognized the number. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "This is Joseph Prado. I was Edwin's notary. I signed that codicil." She stiffened. "Yes, I remember. I got a subpoena today," he said. "I just wanted you to know, I'm not going to play their game. I'll testify truthfully. Your uncle was sharper than I've seen most men 10 years younger. He knew what he wanted." Helen swallowed. "Thank you. That means more than I can say. They'll try to twist it. But some things don't bend." A week later, Helen sat in her own deposition, facing 4 attorneys. Louis sat beside her, but they made no effort to hide their strategy. Janet's lawyer asked about Helen's finances, her retirement, her divorce. Whether she'd ever borrowed money from Edwin. Whether she'd ever been desperate. They wanted to paint her as a woman with motive, but Helen stayed composed. "I didn't manipulate him. I didn't need to," she said. "Edwin made his decision based on observation. He saw who showed up and who didn't. I never asked him for anything. I never even expected anything. And maybe that's why he gave me everything." They didn't like that answer. Late one evening, as Helen sifted through her notes in her living room, her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email. Subject: settlement proposal, Clark Estate. She opened it. "Helen, my client, Janet Sinclair, is prepared to offer a 40% share of the estate in exchange for your withdrawal of the codicil. This offer includes the Montana property and full rights to the Connecticut home. Please advise by Friday." Helen stared at the screen. They were bluffing. The offer wasn't generous, it was strategic. An attempt to make her doubt herself, to make her feel greedy or unworthy. She didn't reply. Instead, she stood up, crossed the room, and opened the small wooden box Edwin had given her years ago for her birthday. Inside were a few photographs, some letters, and a small index card. On it was a quote, handwritten in Edwin's looping script. "In a room full of voices, listen to the one that never asked to speak." She closed the lid. She wasn't walking away. The night before the hearing, Helen couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, the silence of her home interrupted only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath the radiator. It was an insomnia she hadn't felt in years, back when numbers at the firm wouldn't add up or when she'd first signed the divorce papers and suddenly found herself in a home that echoed. By 3 a.m., she was at the kitchen table, the thick ledger Edwin had left in the cabin open before her. The handwritten entries never once mentioned the will. There were no explicit instructions, no legal affirmations. But they didn't need to be. Each page was a character reference written in real time. Small notations that said more than any affidavit. "Helen brought soup again today. It wasn't even for me. It was for the neighbor's kid, who had a fever. She didn't mention it, just slipped the container into their mailbox and left. This is why I trust her. She never asked what I was leaving behind. She asked what I wanted to be remembered for." "That's not the same question." Helen traced the final paragraph on the last page. dated only a few months before Edwin died. If anyone questions my judgment, I hope they look beyond the legal. Helen never needed a signature to be my legacy. But I gave her one anyway. She closed the book gently. Her hands stopped shaking. The courthouse was different now, no longer foreign. She knew the route through security. The elevator buttons. The receptionist's name. The worn armrests of the bench outside courtroom 4B. But today, a different energy hung in the air, sharpened, alert, as if everyone had finally realized what was truly at stake. Lewis met her in the hallway, calm but focused. Janet brought in a new witness, he said. Helen raised an eyebrow. Who? A caretaker. A man named Roger Kemp. Says he helped your uncle during the last 6 months of his life. He's claiming Edwin was forgetful, unstable, possibly coerced. She frowned. There was no full-time caretaker. Exactly. We're already pulling employment records. But he's going to testify under oath today. They entered the courtroom as the judge called the session to order. Janet sat confidently at her table, flanked by 2 attorneys. Marvin was beside her, his jaw tight, his suit a size too expensive for someone who'd last seen Edwin at a barbecue 10 years ago. Roger Kemp, a man in his early 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and a nervous energy, sat quietly behind them. The judge's tone was clipped. Let's proceed with the testimony of Mr. Kemp. Roger stepped forward, was sworn in, and began carefully rehearsed testimony. I was hired through a third-party agency to assist Mr. Clark with daily tasks. Bathing, meal prep, medication reminders. He was confused at times. Asked for his deceased brother once. I'd find him sitting outside at night, talking to people who weren't there. Helen kept her face unreadable. When Lewis stood for cross-examination, his questions were direct. How long were you employed? 6 months. Do you have pay stubs? I was paid in cash. Who hired you? Roger hesitated. A family member, I think. I was contacted through a friend. Lewis stepped closer. Did you ever see this? He held up the ledger. No. Did you know Mr. Clark kept detailed notes on his interactions? No. Did you know he had surveillance cameras installed inside the house for liability protection? Roger blinked. There's no record of your employment, Lewis said, holding up a printed report. No agency. No financial trail. No witnesses. Would you like to revise your statement? Roger looked at Janet. She shifted uncomfortably. No, he muttered. The judge looked unimpressed. Later that afternoon, Helen was called to the stand again. Ms. Browning, the opposing counsel said, voice smooth. You claim you didn't expect to be included in your uncle's will. That's correct. And yet you drove across state lines to secure a personal document after his death? I followed his instructions. In a private letter? In a conversation we had. And the contents of the lockbox support what he told me. The attorney paced. You never questioned why Mr. Clark would disinherit so many of his relatives. In favor of you. I did question it. I still do. But Edwin didn't make decisions to please people. He made them based on character. He was deliberate. And you never manipulated him? Helen turned toward the judge before answering. Your Honor, the people who say I manipulated Edwin are the same people who never showed up. They didn't sit with him when he had a fever. They didn't notice when he stopped drinking his coffee in the morning because it upset his stomach. They weren't there the night he couldn't remember what year it was, but somehow remembered the story of the day I was born. She paused. I didn't take anything from him. He gave it to me. And I showed up enough to know what that means. The courtroom was still. That evening, Helen received an unexpected voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. It was short. Ms. Browning, this is Detective Marquez with the local PD. I was assigned to investigate a recent claim about falsified witness statements in a civil case. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. Helen's fingers hovered over the phone. The war wasn't just legal anymore. It was starting to unravel from the inside. Helen returned the detective's call just after 7 a.m. She didn't sleep again after hearing his message, just made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen, her thumb hovering over the green dial icon. When she finally pressed it, her voice was steady. Detective Marquez? This is Helen Browning. You left me a message. Ms. Browning, thank you for returning my call, he said, his tone efficient but not cold. I was hoping you had a few minutes to talk. I do. I'm investigating a sworn statement submitted in your probate case, specifically, the testimony of Roger Kemp. We've received an anonymous tip that he may have been paid to fabricate his account. Helen leaned back in her chair, the ceramic mug cooling in her hand. Do you know who paid him? We're working on it. I can't disclose all the details, but we traced an ATM withdrawal made to a prepaid debit card the same day Mr. Kemp visited the courthouse. The card was purchased by someone using an alias, but the store's security footage is being reviewed now. Helen closed her eyes for a moment. Do you need me to do anything? Just stay available, Marquez said. If this turns into a criminal matter, your cooperation could help strengthen the legitimacy of the codicil by undermining their motive to contest it. I understand. After she hung up, she sat still for several minutes. Outside, the morning light filtered through the blinds in quiet strips. She could feel it now, the desperation behind the challenge, the fraying of their manufactured narrative. Someone had crossed a line. And that made all the difference. Later that day, Lewis met Helen at his office downtown. A pile of documents already waiting for her on the table. We're entering the final stretch, he said. Judge Fallon's review will be complete by next week. He's asked for closing statements from both sides. After that, he'll issue a ruling. Unless one of them files a separate suit, though I doubt that will hold if the codicil stands. Helen nodded, flipping through the files. Have you heard about the detective's inquiry? I have, Lewis replied. If they prove witness tampering, the whole case could collapse in your favor. At the very least, it'll damage the credibility of their petition. Helen paused, then asked, Do you think Edwin knew it would come to this? Lewis looked at her carefully. I think he understood his family. And he trusted you to finish what he started. That stayed with her. That evening, Helen visited Edwin's grave for the first time since the funeral. It was a modest stone. No grand quotes. Just his name, his dates, and the simple words, he kept his word. She stood there in the quiet for a long time. No one else was around. The cemetery overlooked the edge of town, where trees gave way to the outline of shops and rooftops. Distant traffic murmured like the memory of something you couldn't quite name. I wish you'd told me more, she said aloud. But I think I understand why you didn't. She pulled the folded letter from her coat pocket, his final note, and reread it slowly. The part that struck her now wasn't what he gave her. It was what he asked of her. Be kind, but never small. She had been small most of her life. It wasn't shyness, it was precision. She had spent decades calculating where not to stand, how not to ask too much, how to fit neatly inside expectations, but now the world was watching her refuse to fold. The next morning, Lewis forwarded her an email. Subject line, false testimony. Confirmed. Attached was a short report from the police. Roger Kemp had confessed. According to the report, he had been approached by a third party representing a family member, who offered him $3,000 to testify that Edwin had shown signs of dementia and confusion in the months before his death. He'd been given specific phrases to memorize, and was told it would be a victimless correction to an unfair legal situation. His statement concluded with a line Helen read twice. I didn't think anyone would check. I didn't think she'd fight this hard. Lewis called 20 minutes later. I've already filed a motion to dismiss their contest based on the fraudulent witness statement. It strengthens our position significantly. Does the judge know yet? He does. And Helen, his tone shifted, more personal. This changes everything. That afternoon, Helen returned to Edwin's office for the first time since the funeral. The firm had been emptied out, the partners were moving locations, and the estate sale hadn't yet begun. She still had access. The building smelled of old wood and dust, the scent of a room full of paper memories. She walked past the conference room, the narrow hallway, until she reached his old office. The desk was still there, though stripped of most personal items, but on the far wall, tucked between two bookshelves, she noticed something. A small frame. Crooked. Easy to miss. She stepped closer and adjusted it. Inside was a quote, printed neatly on cream paper, glass fogged with time. The law doesn't ask who shouts loudest. It asks who has proof. She smiled faintly. Edwin had always known what kind of fight this would be. He hadn't chosen her because she was loud or aggressive. He chose her because she would outlast them all. The quiet strength. Proof over noise. It was almost time. The courtroom was different now. Not in structure, but in tone. It no longer buzzed with uncertainty or the smug confidence of those who believed they would inherit by default. It was quieter. Sharper. Every movement, every glance, carried tension, because everyone in the room knew that this was the final phase. Judge Fallon had requested formal closing arguments. No more depositions, no more testimony. Just the law, the facts, and the weight of what it all meant. Helen sat beside Lewis at the petitioner's table, her documents neatly organized, the codicil and its supporting evidence stacked like armor in front of her. Across the aisle, Janet whispered furiously to her attorney. Marvin sat beside her, stiff and unreadable, but he didn't meet Helen's gaze. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Be seated, he said, voice firm. We are here today to hear closing arguments regarding the legitimacy of the codicil dated February 14th, which supersedes the previous will of Mr. Edwin Clark. He turned to Helen's side first. Mr. Harmon, you may begin. Lewis stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, this case is not complicated in principle. though it has been made needlessly complex in strategy. He stepped forward, voice steady. At the heart of this dispute is a single, valid document, a codicil executed by Edwin Clark, witnessed, notarized, and preserved in a secure location known only to the testator and the beneficiary. It revokes all prior wills and names Helen Browning as sole heir and executor. He glanced toward the opposing table. We have provided the original codicil, the notary's sworn affidavit, corroborating testimony from witnesses, and a chain of custody that shows the document remained unaltered from the time it was signed to the time it was submitted to this court. He paused. Opposing counsel has relied on conjecture, emotion, and, unfortunately, a fraudulent witness. Their argument rests on the idea that Mr. Clark was either manipulated or mentally compromised. Yet, no medical records support that claim. And the ledger found at his Montana cabin, written in his own hand, makes his clarity and intent indisputable. He turned back toward the judge. Mr. Clark made a decision, and he did so with full autonomy. The law does not favor volume, it favors evidence. And the evidence, Your Honor, speaks plainly. This codicil is real. And it is binding. He nodded once and returned to his seat. Fallon shifted in his chair. Thank you, Mr. Harmon. He looked to the other table. Miss Farrow? Janet's attorney, a tall woman with graying hair and a precise tone, stood and approached the bench. Your Honor, we do not deny that the codicil exists. We do not deny that it bears Mr. Clark's signature. But we question the circumstances of its creation. She held up a thin folder. Mr. Clark had an established will that had been updated multiple times with the guidance of legal professionals. Suddenly, without informing a single family member, he drafts a new document, one that excludes all prior beneficiaries, and hides it away without legal filing. She paced. Yes, the codicil has a notary seal. But is that proof of clarity? Is that proof of intent? We argue it is not. We believe Helen Browning, while perhaps well-meaning, exerted influence during a vulnerable period in Mr. Clark's life. Her proximity, her assistance, her presence, it was strategic. Helen felt a flicker of heat rise behind her ears, but kept her expression neutral. And the ledger, the attorney continued. Unwitnessed. Unverified. It cannot be cross-examined. It cannot be authenticated beyond handwriting analysis, which we contend is insufficient. She closed the folder. We are not asking this court to rewrite the law. We are asking it to apply scrutiny. Because once this ruling is made, there is no reversal. No retraction. And we believe there is more than enough doubt to disqualify. This codicil is a fair representation of Mr. Clark's true wishes. She returned to her seat. Judge Fallon leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. The room was silent for nearly a minute. Helen could hear her own heartbeat. She stared at the wood grain on the table to keep from glancing across the aisle. Finally, Fallon spoke. This court will issue its ruling in 72 hours. The hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. People rose. Voices murmured, coats gathered. But Helen stayed seated, her legs still, her eyes unfocused. She was suspended in the in-between, 3 days of breath held, of silence stretched thin over everything she had left. Lewis touched her shoulder lightly. You did well. I didn't say anything. You didn't need to, he said. They heard you anyway. That night, Helen returned to Edwin's house, now empty, still technically part of the disputed estate. She'd been given temporary access during proceedings, but this time she didn't linger in the hallways or stare at the old family photographs. Instead, she went to the small study. On the bottom shelf of the bookcase was a thick photo album. Leather-bound. She pulled it out and flipped through the pages. Photos of Edwin at college. At his first law firm. With friends, colleagues, long-forgotten holidays, and then, one photo tucked behind another. She slid it free. It was a picture of her, Helen, seated at a dinner table. Hair tied back. A plate of food before her, mid-laugh. Edwin had taken it without her noticing. On the back, a note in his handwriting. The only person who ever sat with me after the dishes were cleared. Her throat tightened. It wasn't about generosity. It wasn't even about the inheritance. It was about presence. About having been seen, and remembered, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when no one else was paying attention. She returned the photo to the book. 3 days, she would wait, not passively, but fully. Day 1 after the hearing passed like fog. Helen kept herself moving, sorting old mail, donating clothes she hadn't worn in years, wiping down every countertop twice. She found herself counting time not by hours, but by what she could do to avoid watching the clock. The courthouse had said 72 hours. She knew it likely wouldn't be down to the minute, but still, every morning felt heavier than the last. Lewis had advised her to leave the case with him, but Helen couldn't detach herself. This wasn't about distance. It was about History. On the second evening, as dusk folded itself over the horizon, Helen walked the neighborhood loop she'd memorized over years of early retirement. Familiar houses, familiar dogs behind fences. Some neighbors waved. A few even asked about the case, gentle curiosity wrapped in polite silence. It's going how it should, she answered every time, not revealing more, but inside, she was tightening. Not from fear, not anymore, but from the weight of holding steady. At exactly 11:07 a.m. on the third day, Lewis called. Do you want me to come by in person? He asked. His tone was unreadable. Controlled. Helen stood at her living room window, fingers brushing the curtain. No. Just say it. He took a short breath. You won. Silence on the line. Helen sat down slowly. The judge ruled the codicil valid. Declared you the sole heir and executor of Edwin Clark's estate. He cited the original notarization, chain of custody, and, Lewis hesitated, then added, the fraudulent testimony as key elements in undermining the contest. Helen didn't speak. She stared at the hardwood floor, trying to let the words settle. There will be paperwork, filings, asset transfers, he continued, but the decision is final. No appeals unless new evidence surfaces, which the judge explicitly stated he doesn't expect. Still, she didn't answer. Helen? She closed her eyes. I'm here. He paused. I know it doesn't feel like fireworks. But you did it. No, she whispered. He did it. I just showed up. The next morning, the official envelope arrived, court seal embossed on the front, thick paper heavy with finality. Helen read it all twice. Then once more out loud, as if saying the words would make them more real. She was now the legal executor of Edwin Clark's estate. All financial, property, and legal responsibilities now belonged to her. She was also the sole beneficiary of the Montana cabin, the Connecticut home, the investment accounts, the art collection stored in a climate-controlled facility she hadn't yet visited, the remainder of his law library, and the obligation to close out his affairs with dignity. Later that afternoon, she received a second envelope. Smaller. No return address. Inside was a single handwritten card. You think you've won. But this wasn't yours to take. He was manipulated. And you'll be remembered for what you stole. She read it twice, then tore it in half. Not in anger. In recognition. Janet wasn't finished fuming, but she was finished mattering. That evening, Helen drove to the Connecticut house. Edwin's home. Now hers. The front steps were cracked, just like she remembered. The porch light still flickered. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air still holding the scent of cedar and old paper. She walked room to room, cataloging not just furniture and fixtures, but memories. Her uncle's chair near the fireplace. The floorboard that always creaked near the hallway. The small dent in the wall from when they'd tried to hang a too-heavy mirror one Thanksgiving. Upstairs, in what had once been a guest room, she found a box labeled Helen. Inside, a postcard she'd sent him from a college trip to Boston. A yellowed program from her retirement celebration. A photo of her as a child, missing a front tooth, holding a cat she barely remembered. A typed list titled, Things Helen Taught Me. She held that paper in her hands for a long time. Read, silence isn't weakness. Loyalty doesn't advertise itself. Showing up is a language. Kindness isn't small. Let the proof speak. Tears came quietly, surprising her by how gentle they were. Not hot, not angry, just soft, slow release. Helen spent the night in the house. No TV. No distractions. Just her, the walls, and the steady hum of a place that had waited for her to return, not as a visitor, but as something more permanent. She sat on the porch after midnight, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, coffee cooling in her hands. She didn't feel victorious. She felt anchored. She thought about the years behind her, the safe ones, the restrained ones, the ones where she let others speak louder and assumed they had more to say. Now, she understood something else. You don't have to take the spotlight to be remembered. You just have to keep showing up when it matters most, and sometimes, the quiet ones are the only ones who know how to hold the weight of legacy. The silence of Edwin's house was different now. Before, it had felt like vacancy, absence. But since the court's ruling, it had settled into something else, stillness. Ownership didn't make it hers immediately, but each hour spent among the dust and details pulled her further inward, as if the house were slowly agreeing to accept her. Helen moved through each room with deliberate slowness, not as a tourist in someone else's memory, but as someone who'd inherited responsibility for it all. The photographs, the books, the drawer filled with fountain pen refills, she catalogued not for legal transfer, but for meaning. Down in the basement, she found the filing cabinets. 3 of them. Locked. Each drawer marked in her uncle's unmistakably precise handwriting, tax, personal, reference. She used the master key provided by the estate attorney. The top drawer of the personal cabinet was filled with legal pads, most half-filled, all dated. She flipped through them without urgency, expecting tax notes or old grocery lists. Instead, she found something else. A series of pages marked alternate letters, not for filing. They weren't drafts of the will. They were reflections. Versions of letters he'd written to people who would never see them, unless someone like her found them. Each one began with a name: Janet, Marvin, Ellen, Tom. All family. Each letter was a variation on a theme: forgiveness, disappointment, memory. But none of them read like vengeance. Dear Janet, I don't hold your ambition against you. But I wish you'd come over when I got the flu last spring. I remember calling, and you saying you were too busy. That's not an accusation. It's just what happened. Dear Marvin, you once told me you couldn't come to the cabin because it was too far for something that didn't matter. I didn't respond. But it did matter to me. Helen's hands shook slightly as she folded the pages back into place. He had written these not to wound, but to release. Edwin had spent his final years drawing lines around what he could control and letting go of what he couldn't. She wasn't angry with him either. She understood what it was like to disappear into the background of other people's lives. It was easier to forget what you didn't have to see. A few days later, Lewis called to finalize the estate transfer timeline. Technically, he said, you could begin liquidating assets immediately. There are no injunctions in place, no pending appeals. I'm not selling anything yet, Helen replied. He paused. The cabin? No, she said. Especially not the cabin. And the house? She looked around Edwin's living room. The afternoon light made the carpet look warmer than she remembered. I'm not sure yet. Lewis didn't press. He knew by now that when Helen wasn't sure, she was still thinking, not wavering. Later that afternoon, Helen received an envelope from the law office where Edwin had practiced. One of his former partners had retired and was clearing old files. Inside was a single document, a handwritten note from Edwin, dated nearly 10 years prior. To be opened only if Helen is the one reading it. She unfolded the note, written in his signature black ink. If this reached you, then you've already been through enough. So this isn't more instruction. Just this: there's a folder in the cabin, under the floorboard in the study, marked Final History. It's not legal. But it's mine. And maybe it's yours now too. Helen stood motionless, the letter in her hand. She thought about the quiet strength he'd always praised in her, not loud, not showy, but steady. She booked a flight to Montana for the following morning. The cabin smelled the same: pine, ash, and a faint echo of old tobacco. She didn't pause in the kitchen or on the porch this time. She went directly to the study. The floorboard near the bookshelf gave with a soft groan when she pressed her foot on it, just like he'd once mentioned when telling her about the hidey hole that survived 3 owners. She knelt, lifted it gently, and reached inside. Her fingers touched something wrapped in cloth. It was a thick, weathered folder. She sat cross-legged on the floor and opened it. Inside were old photos, black and white, some faded, and a stack of typed pages. Each one detailed a memory, dated and annotated, stories from Edwin's early career, cases he couldn't talk about publicly, personal reflections on moments he'd never shared. But there was more. A short handwritten line appeared at the top of the last page: legacy isn't what you leave in your will. It's what people remember without needing paper to prove it. Helen sat there for a long time, pages spread around her like a quiet archive. She realized then, the estate had never been just about the property, the money, or even the legal fight. It was about what Edwin had built beneath the surface, a record of presence, of values, of choosing someone not for what they asked for, but for how they carried what they'd been given. And now, she had all of it, not just the cabin, or the house, or the accounts. She had the unseen parts. The story beneath the will. That night, as snow flurried softly outside the cabin windows, Helen placed the folder on the desk, lit the fireplace, and wrote her own first letter. Not a legal document, not a confession, just a record. She titled it, For Whoever Comes Next. The snow in Montana had thickened overnight. By morning, the cabin looked like something from a postcard, powdered white, wrapped in silence, the pine trees bowing slightly beneath the weight. Helen sat by the fireplace with a wool blanket draped over her knees and a mug of coffee growing cold beside her. The folder marked Final History lay closed on the desk nearby, its contents now imprinted in her memory. She had read every page twice, then once more just for the cadence of Edwin's voice and his writing. Some stories were light, fragments of old jokes, dinners with forgotten colleagues. Others were heavy, regrets, confessions, the slow unspooling of a man who had quietly carried far more than he'd ever said aloud. What struck her wasn't just the content, it was the discipline. Edwin had written all of it with the same precision he brought to everything else. But not for legal protection. For clarity. For truth. And, it seemed, for her. Helen wasn't sure how long she sat there before she noticed the envelope. It had fallen behind the desk, wedged between the wood and the baseboard. She reached for it cautiously, dust clinging to the paper. No name. No seal. But inside, a single handwritten page. The handwriting wasn't Edwin's, she read. Helen, I don't expect you to read this, but if you are, then you deserve more honesty than I offered in life. This is Janet. I found the codicil years ago. In a folder at Edwin's office, tucked between case files. I never told anyone. I was too afraid of what it meant, what it would take from me. Not just the money, but the identity. The unspoken agreement that someone like me was supposed to get something, and someone like you wasn't. I didn't destroy it. I couldn't. But I made sure it stayed buried. I thought time would take care of it. That no one would ever think to look that deep. But you did. Of course you did. I'm not sorry for wanting more. But I am sorry for what I became trying to get it. You earned every bit of what he left you. Maybe not with blood, but with something harder, presence. The kind that doesn't need to speak to be heard. Don't forgive me. But understand me, if you can. J. Helen reread the letter slowly, the words pulsing with something raw, not quite redemption, but recognition. It wasn't closure. It was weight. A quiet admission left where no one else would ever find it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the back of Edwin's ledger. 2 days later, back in Connecticut, Helen met with Lewis to finalize the asset transfer paperwork. He slid a folder across the desk with the precision of someone used to these moments. Deed for the Connecticut property, he said. Bank accounts are already cleared. The Montana cabin's title is processing. You'll receive official documentation in 10 business days. Helen nodded. And the firm's library? She asked. It's yours. No restrictions. You can donate it, keep it, or sell it. Edwin left no conditions. She tapped the edge of the folder thoughtfully. I'll donate it to the Community Law Center downtown. Quiet places need strong books. Lewis smiled faintly. You're building something, aren't you? I don't know if I'm building, she said. But I'm not hiding. That weekend, Helen held a private gathering at Edwin's Connecticut house. No grand event. No press release. Just 8 folding chairs, a pot of soup, a tray of old family photos, and handwritten notes beside each. She invited people Edwin had known in his later years, his former paralegal, the barista from the cafe he frequented every Thursday, the neighbor who shoveled his walkway without asking. And one seat for someone who didn't respond, Janet. They came quietly, respectfully. One by one, they wandered through the house, sharing memories, short stories, half-formed thoughts. No one talked about the will. No one talked about the fight. It was the first time Helen saw Edwin through someone else's eyes, reflected not in possessions, but in the residue of kindness. Near the end, the barista, a shy young woman named Shayla, approached Helen and handed her a small note Edwin had once written on the back of a coffee sleeve. Kindness isn't in the gesture. It's in the follow-through. Helen held the sleeve between her fingers and thought, maybe legacy wasn't something you left. Maybe it was something you passed forward, one quiet decision at a time. That night, Helen returned to her own home. She stood in the center of the living room, the court letter and deed still folded on the side table, untouched. She didn't need to hang them on the wall or frame them. They weren't trophies. They were transitions. She opened a new notebook. The first page she titled simply, What I Will Leave Behind. She didn't write anything else that night, but she left the pen uncapped. The days moved differently after the court ruling. Not faster, just quieter. Not emptier, just less defensive. For the first time in years, Helen stopped waking up with a feeling she couldn't name, like she was always preparing for something she hadn't been invited to. Now, she moved without explanation. She didn't ask permission before opening drawers that weren't hers a month ago. She didn't second-guess every step in the Connecticut house. She simply existed there, fully, in a space once occupied by someone who had always made room for her, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. But Helen wasn't done. Not with Edwin's memory. Not with what she'd inherited. There were no more arguments. No letters from lawyers. No threats from Janet. Only a silence that asked her what she was going to do now that no one was pushing back. The law library was the first thing she let go of. She spent a full afternoon cataloging every volume on Edwin's shelves, treatises on tort law, aged legal digests, philosophy books with marginalia scribbled in Edwin's handwriting. She contacted the Community Law Center downtown and offered the full collection. They accepted with disbelief and gratitude. When the movers came to collect the books, Helen stood on the front steps and watched as box after box disappeared into the truck. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like purpose. She kept only 3 volumes for herself, a 1972 edition of The Ethics of Law, Edwin's own copy of Black's Law Dictionary, and a slim paperback with a torn cover that simply read, On Presence. Inside the cover of that last book, Edwin had written, To Helen. For all the rooms you filled without needing to speak. She held it in her lap long after the movers left. Her second act of inheritance wasn't legal at all. It started with a letter she wrote to the local community center, offering to fund a monthly legal clinic. Free advice, real assistance. Nothing performative. No plaque with her name. Her offer was accepted within a week. She didn't plan to run the clinic. She wasn't a lawyer. But she showed up to the first Saturday anyway, slipping into a back corner with a thermos of coffee and a notepad. The waiting room filled quickly, a single mother unsure about a custody filing, a tenant trying to fight an eviction notice, a teenager facing a suspended license, and no one to advocate for him. Helen didn't speak much, but she made sure the volunteers had snacks. She kept the coffee fresh. She organized forms. And when people left the room, she nodded, not as a gesture of pity, but recognition. It wasn't charity. It was continuation. This, she realized, was Edwin's work, just carried differently now. One afternoon, about a month after the ruling, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single note card. A typed message. * You made the right call. I wasn't ready to see it then. J*, no signature. No apology. Just that. Helen folded the card once, then placed it in the back of the same notebook she'd started weeks earlier. What I will leave behind. She didn't need to reply. Some reconciliations happen in the quiet space between two people no longer trying to win. Spring crept in slowly. The Connecticut trees shed their gray, and the sky opened a little wider each morning. One day, Helen returned to the Montana cabin, this time not to uncover anything, but simply to be there. She brought only a duffel bag and the book Edwin had given her. She spent 3 nights there. No phone. No noise. Just the sound of her own thoughts and the creak of the wood beneath her feet. The cabin didn't feel like Edwin anymore. It felt like hers. One evening, she sat on the porch and reread the letter he'd left in the ledger. She knew it by heart now, but something about the act of reading it aloud, to the trees, to herself, made it feel new again. You don't chase things, Helen. You watch. You wait. You think. That's why I chose you. She whispered the words like a benediction, and for the first time since all of this began, she let herself feel it fully, not the fear, not the burden, but the honor. When she returned home, she wrote 2 letters. The first was to the executor of her own small estate, nothing large, but enough to matter. She named a scholarship fund at the community center, the legal clinic, and, as a final note, she wrote, pass it on to whoever stayed late, asked nothing, and kept showing up. The second letter she sealed in an envelope and addressed to no one. Inside it, she wrote, don't confuse quiet for absence. Some people build legacies one unnoticed gesture at a time. And when the noise settles, those are the ones that remain. She tucked the envelope into her ledger. She would keep it there until it was time to pass it on. The Connecticut house looked different in late spring. The trees had thickened, wrapping the property in a quiet green cocoon. Dandelions had claimed small corners of the lawn, and the breeze from the nearby river slipped through open windows with the scent of lilacs and damp stone. For the first time, it felt like a place where life continued, not just a space where something had ended. Helen stood in the living room, holding the same framed photo she had stared at so many times before, Edwin, young and laughing, one hand midair as if in argument, the other around the shoulders of someone just outside the frame. She had always wondered who'd taken it. Now she thought, maybe it didn't matter. Some pictures held stories no one would ever fully explain. Some legacies? Too. She placed the photo back on the shelf and looked around. The bookshelves were emptier now. Many of the volumes had found new homes, but the room didn't feel vacant. It felt ready. The legal dust had long settled. Titles were transferred. Accounts consolidated. Janet had sent one final letter, and signed, returning a small box of Edwin's personal items she'd once taken by mistake. Helen hadn't opened it. Not yet. But she kept it in the study, beside the ledger. What mattered more was what had filled the space since the clinic downtown was growing. The community center had expanded its weekend programs. And Helen had found herself speaking more, not loudly, but often. One evening each month, she hosted something she called Letters Unsent. Not a formal event. Just chairs, tea, and a space for people to bring the things they'd never said. Grief, apology, love, uncertainty, it all came in quiet waves. Helen rarely read her own letters, but she listened. And somehow, that felt like enough. On a Tuesday in June, Helen returned to the cabin once more. She hadn't planned the trip. She simply woke up, packed a weekend bag, and drove. The air in Montana was sharp with pine and morning fog. The cabin greeted her like an old friend, unchanged. This time, she brought someone with her. A young woman named Shayla, once a barista, now a second-year law student, and the first intern at the community legal clinic. Edwin would have liked her, Helen thought. Bright, steady, and unwilling to posture, they spent the afternoon clearing out a small back room that Helen had always ignored. It had once been storage, but now it would become something else, a reading room, a place to work, a retreat for whoever needed silence and clarity. Did he know you'd do all this? Shayla asked as they folded blankets and set books on shelves. No. Helen replied. But he knew I could. Later that night, Helen sat on the porch alone. The stars in Montana always came without hesitation. No clouds, no haze, just bright, unapologetic light stretching over the trees. She opened her notebook. What I will leave behind, and wrote one final page. You don't always get to choose how people see you. Sometimes you're the quiet one, the background, the afterthought. But presence is its own kind of inheritance. What you keep says more than what you're given. And what you pass on says everything. She didn't sign it. Some stories didn't need a name at the end. In the months that followed, Helen made a few small changes. She added Edwin's ledger and letters, minus the most personal pages, to the archive at the law center. Not on display. Just available. For those who needed reminders that legacy wasn't always written in contracts, she funded a bench near the courthouse, not in Edwin's name, but with a small plaque that read, "For the ones who waited quietly and still came back." And she wrote one last letter. She placed it in an envelope marked simply, "To be opened only if you're listening." She left it in the cabin, beneath the same floorboard where Edwin had once left his. It read, "I wasn't supposed to matter. That's how it felt for most of my life. But someone saw me. And because of that, I learned to see others. If you found this, maybe it's because you were quiet too. Maybe because you thought no one noticed. They did. Keep showing up. That's all legacy really is." Helen never called it justice. Never called it victory. She didn't tell people about the courtroom or the codicil or the things that almost slipped away. She let them find her in the steady work, the quiet hours, the space she made around others. The world didn't remember the loudest ones forever, but sometimes, it remembered the ones who stayed, and Helen had stayed, until she became everything Edwin hoped she would be.